All right, welcome back to the Poulos Podcast. Before we get into this episode about ego, a couple of announcements. One, I'm wearing my new Life is Beautiful t-shirt out on my merch store. It's beautiful. It's cozy. Life is beautiful. Give it a cop. georgepoulos.com/store. Link in description. And I decided to try to start offering one-on-one sessions. So if anyone feels compelled to speak with me one-on-one, this is a new experiment. I can answer your questions, provide you more direct advice based on your situation, or we can just talk. I had this idea after receiving a message on Instagram where someone said they felt compelled to speak with me, and I figured, why not extend this as an offering? So, and your support and contribution will fuel me to continue this form of expression that I'm doing on the podcast, and I appreciate it very much. Let's get into the episode. All right, welcome back to the Poulos Podcast. If you didn't know, I didn't start raising my hips when I sit down to meditate. It took me a while to start doing that, even though, it's very common to sit on a meditation cushion. But when I actually got myself a meditation cushion and started raising my hips, pointing the knees downwards, it's like the body just falls into alignment much easier. I bring this up because I just rolled up a sweatshirt like to put under my butt here while I sit down to record this episode, and I feel like this is going to be a game changer. I feel like I've sunken in much more quickly. I got a really good question about the ego on the YouTube comments. Thank you to the commenter, and I will read the question. This episode made me realize how much my ego controls me and my life up to this point. When I first started listening to your podcast, I had almost no idea what ego even meant, and I think even today I still have only a distant vision of what it is and what it is fully capable of. I don't know what to do now, how to break it, because it broke me before. How do I deal with the ego? So I remember starting to get into my studies about spirituality. I also really wasn't sure what the ego was, and it really took a long time for me to fully come to an understanding of what the ego is, particularly when it's spoken about in the spiritual context, by spiritual teachers. It's like a very central theme is the ego, and it is very hard to understand. My theory about why it's hard to understand the ego is because the more you understand, the more you're aware of the ego, the more it loses its grasp on you. So, normally we are operating out of ego unconsciously, and we don't have a concept for what ego is. Literally, when we start to have a concept for what ego is, and we start to become aware of how it plays a role in our life, that awareness literally reduces the power that the ego has over us. Because when we're unconscious of it, we're simply blindly following its power and its influence. And the simple acknowledging of what it is a huge step in the awakening journey. So, first of all, don't be hard on yourself if this is a hard concept to grasp, because literally, the more you understand what the ego is, that is literally tracking along with your spiritual journey. If you have a complete understanding of the ego, you are that much more awakened, literally. Does that make sense? And it speaks to this power that language can have to give us an awareness of certain concepts. It's funny sometimes when I'm sitting on this podcast, I feel like I'm talking about nothing, but there is this label ego that I have in my mind, and I have a pretty good understanding of what that word means when it comes to the patterns of my mind, and that understanding helps me break free of it. So it is a powerful tool in this case. And I'm going to, bear with me. This is a difficult concept, but I'm going to try my best to walk you through what the ego is, how I started to understand what the ego is through my study of spirituality, and then, what we can do about it. So thanks again to the commenter for asking that great question. In general, if you're listening to this podcast and you're hung up on anything, you're unsure about anything, I really encourage you to just dump your thoughts and questions into the comments section, into my DMs, wherever you can access me, wherever is most natural. And I just spilled some coffee on myself. Please ask away. I consider this podcast to be a collective inquiry into the truth of things. We're trying to see things clearly together. So I think one of the reasons that it's difficult to understand what the ego is in a spiritual context is because the way we are taught about ego culturally is like someone who has a big ego, right? We know what that means. Someone with a big ego is someone who is self-centered, thinks they're the shit, doesn't really regard the wellness of the people around him, operates in the world with this kind of inflated sense of self. And that is a good starting point to go from, but it's not really the full picture of what ego is, right? So that's kind of what I grew up thinking the ego was this kind of like elated sense of self, and this like hubris and this arrogance, someone with a big ego. That's kind of all I had. So then when I started hearing spiritual teachers talk about the ego, I kind of didn't really understand, but let me try to break down how I understand it now. So the ego is your sense of self. It is this feeling that you are, man, it's going to be hard to describe. Just bear with me. This feeling that you are a separate person. Anytime you attach the label of I to something, that's your ego at work. It's like, I have this job, right? Back in the day, I would have said, I'm a skateboarding YouTuber. I am a boyfriend. I am a roommate. All these I labels, everything we identify with and we think that is us, that's the ego operating, right? The ego is what creates a separate sense of self. The ego is what makes us think that we are special, right? So the ego will grab onto our possessions. It will grab onto our accomplishments. It will grab onto our relationships. The ego collects things, and it collects things in order to boost this sense of I. That's kind of the role of the ego. The issue with the ego is as it collects and grabs onto things in order to bolster the sense of self, the sense of separateness, the sense of I, whatever it can grasp to bolster that sense of self can also be lost, because it's taking things from the outside, right? It's taking my physical performance on a skateboard and attaching identity to it, attaching sense of self-worth to it. It's taking how many friends I have, the quality of those friendships, and attaching sense of self to it. It's taking whether or not I'm in a romantic relationship, how good is that relationship, and it's attaching a sense of self to it. It's taking where do I live, all these external circumstances. How successful am I in my career? The ego takes externals and creates this idea of self. That's what the ego does, right? It grabs onto things on the outside and convinces you that you are those things. So Ram Dass loves to say this quote. It's that the ego is a beautiful servant, but a lousy master. This is a really illuminating quote, and let me try to explain it. So we are taught in the Western culture that we are the ego, right? So we we are raised, and what that means is that we are raised to think that this sense of self, is made up of our external accomplishments, possessions, collections, the things that we do, the things that we have, the people that are around us, the place that we're in. We are raised to think that these are the things that matter and provide us a sense of self, right? And again, as I described, the problem with that is that everything outside is impermanent. So our over-attachment to the ego is the root of much of our suffering, right? Because if your ego is attached to the idea of getting a particular job or continuing on a particular career path or making sure a particular relationship works, the nature of life does not support permanence, right? All of these external factors are in flux. The only permanent thing that we have in our lives is our own awareness. That will be continuous throughout our entire lives. But all of the external factors that we are aware of, including our relationships, our accomplishments, our possessions, these will all be in a constant flux. So when we treat the ego as everything, and when we derive our sense of self-worth from the ego, we are setting ourselves up for suffering, because the external is going to change, and that's going to cause a freak out in the ego, because the way the ego operates is that when it has something, it wants it. It's very comfortable, right? So when we're in our, when our lives are settled and stable and we have our apartments and our relationships and our friends and our jobs, the ego feels very, very comfortable. Things are stable. The things that create the sense of self, and I say things, that's what the ego does. It's all things. When those are stable, the ego has no reason to panic. But then when nature comes in and starts changing external circumstances, the ego is built to make you freak out, because its sense of self, the sense of self, is threatened. The awareness is always stable. When external circumstances change, we are aware of that. We don't have to panic. That's what letting go of the ego is about. We are taught in this culture by our parents, by our society, by our school system, that our sense of self-worth, our I, is essentially something that we can write on a piece of paper. It's our list of accomplishments. It's our list of possessions, our list of friendships, our list of relationships. The perspective that I'm finding through my spiritual journey is that all the stuff that we can write down on a piece of paper is completely irrelevant. So I talk all the time about the journey I went through with my skateboarding channel. And, something I've never outright verbally clarified is that there's nothing wrong with skateboarding or having a YouTube channel. This is my example of something in my life. This is a spiritual lesson for me. It's going to look different for you. This is one of the things that I was ego identified to, right? Because of my upbringing, because I was taught that I am my ego, that my ego is my master, I worked extremely hard to build up my skateboarding YouTube channel and to become a talented skateboarder, because all of these efforts were bolstering my ego, were enhancing my sense of self. So then when I had all this talent on a skateboard and I had all this success on YouTube, that was me, right? That's what the ego does. It completely identifies self with things that are out here. And how I was describing that leads to suffering. It's because then I had it. I worked so hard. I got it. Now I'm anxious because what if I lose it? And what if What if I lose certain abilities on my skateboard over time? And what if my viewers stop caring about my videos? What if my creative desires change? Then there's anxiety. Ego attachment leads to suffering because then we're holding on to something for dear life, for our identity. So then when circumstances, for example, for me, circumstances changed on the inside, but I could not let go because that was who I was. Right? So there's nothing wrong with skateboarding. There's nothing wrong with having a YouTube channel. In fact, I'm doing it again. The reason that the whole skateboarding thing is so illuminating in my spiritual journey is because I saw this lesson. I saw why attaching sense of self to anything that's happening outside, and that includes career success, that includes the hobbies we're passionate about, can lead to a very anxious attachment and a lot of pain when change inevitably comes. If your sense of self comes from your ego, then you have to be really anxious all the time about maintaining all of these external circumstances, because the maintenance of those external circumstances is creating your idea of you, right? This idea of you is very fragile, and it makes it so you have to operate in life in a panic. You've got so much to maintain. Your relationships, your career. You got to make sure everything is perfect so that you can feel whole. It's a very anxious place to operate. And most people are operating that way, and I operated that way until I woke up, which was only, a couple years ago, Spent my whole life this way, and this anxious, it's like, that it's that feeling that you're juggling all this stuff and you got to stay on top of everything. That's because your ego needs everything to be sorted so that it can be calm. And it's we are born out of the total existence, right? We're a part of the fabric of everything. So there can be nothing wrong with us. So there's nothing wrong with the ego. What went wrong is that we were conditioned to believe that we are the ego. That's what puts us in a state of great tension and anxiety. When you meditate and find the observer perspective is aware of all the games that the ego is playing. It's aware of all of your external circumstances. It can certainly dance with and enjoy those external circumstances, but when you shift your focus, your center from head to heart, from ego to spirit, you can deal with all the externals calmly. And there's not this anxious, manic rush to sort everything out, because none of it really matters, This is a big, juicy topic. Right, so that's the problem. It's the over-identification with the ego. That's what gets us wrapped up in things that leads to inevitable suffering. When you're over-identified with the ego, it's like you're always in this protective state. You're always protecting yourself. It also creates great divides between ourselves and others. And it's I don't know, the ego has all these things built into it that just don't feel good. It's if somebody wrongs you, or if somebody just doesn't like you, your ego is the part of you that takes it personally. Because the ego, it always needs to be right. The ego always needs to be right. So when someone doesn't like you, your ego is the part of you that makes up a story about why they're an asshole. It prevents you from looking within and finding peace within yourself. It's very strange that this and right, understanding the ego is almost so difficult, because the ego knows that when it is understood, it will lose its power. Like, it's almost like this force within us is so strong. It like resists our urges. Like, ego is the part of you that tells you it's stupid and meaningless to meditate. And my theory is that because the ego has a built-in resistance to its own diminishing, right? It's like somehow the ego knows that building in a meditative and a spiritual practice will diminish its power. So it will literally like find excuses to resist personal growth. And like the ego like actively resists the journey of inner peace. It's really fascinating. Another example of how the ego can self-sabotage is the ego is the part of you that tells you that spirituality is mumbo jumbo, right? Anything, any avenue that you can take that will reduce the power of the ego will create an excuse to invalidate it. Because the ego survives by your attachment to things, right? People, where you live, your circumstances. When the ego sees that you're considering a spiritual journey, it's almost like it can preemptively anticipate that you're going to start to let go of those things, so it gets threatened, right? Really what understanding the role of the ego is it's a process of deconditioning. But it's like the strength of the ego, the resistance that the ego has to your spiritual journey is a result of how hardened we are in our conditionings, because we were taught at a very vulnerable age that we are our accomplishments, that we need to achieve in order to be whole. So it's that conditioning that we're feeling when we feel the resistance of the ego. Just cracked the journal because I wrote a little bit about this morning. Oh, okay. One of the most insidious things that the ego does is it also attaches to your own suffering. Right? So if you are in a place in your life where you are not happy, you are not getting the things you want, you don't have those friendships, you don't have that relationship that you want, you don't have the career that you want, the ego will take those circumstances and attach your sense of self to it. So then it will actively resist you getting the things that you want. It's mind-blowingly insidious, and it highlights the importance of understanding the role of the ego in our lives, becoming aware of it so that we can not eliminate it, but recalibrate it, right? Like the Ram Dass quote, the ego is a beautiful servant, but a terrible master. We just want to recalibrate it. We don't want to be wrapped up into that ego. We want to be aware of what it's doing, right? So a lot of times throughout my day when I'm like, I'm working through a lot with my creative process. Like, this podcast is pretty new for me. A lot of the times I'll have these thoughts that are very powerful that are like, you're not saying anything smart or new, and who do you think you are to say all these things on this podcast? Like, do you really think anybody cares? That's the ego. I know that's the ego, right? Why is it doing that? I don't know. but I'm aware that the ego is trying to self-sabotage me, right? Because this artistic it's like, like I said, conditioning. Like I was conditioned to believe that like external opinions mattered, had anything to do with my sense of self. So when I was doing that skate channel, right, I was like taking people's opinions, view counts, performance, numbers, external success, attaching my self-worth to it. So now that I'm breaking free of this illusion, my ego will creep up again, and it will worry what people think of me. Are people from my past going to see what I'm saying on this podcast and posting about on social media and think I'm crazy? What are they going to think of me, right? The ego, wants to be safe. The ego does not want you to expand artistically. The ego thinks that it is special. The ego is this part of you that thinks, I am special. Therefore, I can't slip up, because what are people going to think about me if I slip up, if I sound a little crazy? The ego won't let you express your natural gifts and your talents, and it won't let you express yourself freely. It puts this layer on it of, how is this going to line up with this version of I that I have created? Right? The ego wants everything to bolster this vision of I. This is why when I really started breaking free of ego, I wrote this line, how freeing to admit that I do not yet know myself, right? The ego is stable, it's solid, and knows who you are. It's your solid identity. Coming to the realization that you don't know who you are is another example of breaking free of the ego, because you're opening yourself, allowing yourself to do anything, experiment, right? The ego can't exist in the present moment, because in the present moment, you're all intuition and impulse. But if you're living in ego, the ego is calculating who you've been based on the past, trying to make sure your actions in the present line up with who you've been in the past, this identity, this sense of self. And it's thinking, is this past identity, the ego is calculating, is this action I'm going to take in the present going to line up with the identity I've created already in the past, so that it can project that continued identity into the future? When your ego does that, you actually miss the present moment entirely. And you're also suppressing your own ability to act spontaneously and intuitively in the moment, which is where life is. So when you are over prioritizing the ego, you're missing life. You're missing the present moment in that way, because those ego calculations take longer than an instant, right? My ego keeps trying to self-sabotage my artistic efforts, telling me I don't know what I'm talking about. I can't have a spiritual podcast. What if I'm wrong about things? ... I notice and I'm aware that this is happening. My ego wants to pull the plug anytime a single piece of content doesn't get a lot of views. See, I was right all along. Nobody cares. Look at the fight my ego puts up in anticipation to the episode I'm going to record today about ego. Well, I send love to the ego. I'm not trying to kill it, just readjust its place in my life. I was taught that I am the ego. This is the illusion of separation that has created much suffering. I am not the ego. I am aware of ego and everything it does. I am aware of its nuances and functions. I am aware that getting too caught up in ego, in specialness, is self-destructive. It won't let me make a mistake because I'm special, and what if it tarnishes my reputation? The ego takes shit personally when someone doesn't like us back. To protect itself, we create reasons why they're an asshole. When ego is doing its thing, it's so effective that you might feel like you're going to die if you don't follow its orders. But just try it. Watch it in meditation. Go through the anxiety that you usually compulsively listen to the ego to quell. Just watch it. Watch how nothing will happen. Nothing at all. You won't die. Right? Build yourself an arsenal of evidence that the ego is irrational. Damn, I wrote that kind of good. Right? When we are unconscious of the ego, when we don't even know what the concept of the ego means, we are simply following the ego's orders, right? It is our master. When we feel anxious because we're going to lose something, because our career is coming to an end or coming to a transition, when change comes, the ego gets threatened. And through our upbringing, we've just been instinctively, without without being aware at all, just going into the path of the ego, resisting change, self-sabotaging ourselves to make us temporarily comfortable, right? Quelling that anxiety in that moment for a detrimental long-term consequence, right? Because if we continue to follow the ego, we're never living in the present. We're totally losing access to our true being. I like what I wrote in that journal entry, which was just this morning, right? Build yourself up evidence. Don't listen to the ego for once. When something external in your life is changing and you feel that panic, that your sense of self is being threatened, just let the whole thing happen, right? Usually that panic that starts bubbling up in our body, we don't actually allow it to process through us. We listen to the ego and resist the change. And that makes us feel better in the moment, but that's actually resisting nature, the nature of change. If you can just for once, just sit through, just watch that whole thing happening, you won't die, despite how it may feel in your body. You won't die. And then you'll be sitting there like, what just happened? Did I just allow that change to happen? And I'm here and I'm fine? That's the kind of evidence you want to build up. That's going to start to help you tame the role that the ego has in your life, or tame how unconsciously tied up into the ego you are. My ego, if I was tied up to my ego would not let me express myself like this, because my ego would be so worried about what people are thinking about me. And that would be very threatening to my sense of self, right? When I was so tied up in my ego during my skate channel days, I needed every video to get a lot of views, right? Views have been a journey for me. A journey of letting go. I needed every video to get a lot of views so that people saw me as a successful YouTuber, because I needed people to validate how my ego saw myself. The cascade of the ego is so shallow and it can fall apart at any moment, and that's why we're always in a state of anxiety and stress. When you can let go of that and just realize that you're fine as you are and you don't need the external accomplishments, you're so free. You're so free. It doesn't matter. There's nothing to defend. You can just output and express. And that's what's finally happening on this podcast. It's taken me a long time to get here. And now I'm just finally out of my own way, finally not putting up defenses, finally don't need external validation to validate my sense of self, right? Because there is no self. There's no self. It's just a continuum. It's a lot better. The ego is very scared that our career will fall apart if we let go of its grasp on us. But my belief is that our career will likely thrive, especially if you're a creative, if you have a creative career, if you're an artist. Letting go of the ego is huge, because then you're going to stop calculating what is suitable, what is pleasing to produce. Then you're just going to let it come out. You're going to stop calculating what relationships are going to validate this idea of who I am. And instead, you're just going to flow into the relationships that the universe presents you with. So it's really important. It's really important because of our upbringing, because of how we were raised. It's really important to understand the ego and to become aware of the influence it has on us. And I think it really, in my upbringing, it really stemmed from being told that I need to achieve. You got to get good grades in order to be a good person, in order to keep going, you need to get good grades. You need to achieve, right? And then a lot of us bring that energy into our careers and our relationships. Everything has to be good. We have to do a good job. It's a horrible way to live. And it's a constant suppression of our true nature. So it's going to take a long time to understand what the ego is. I'm still on my journey of understanding what the ego is, right? It's a deep, deep set conditioning. It got into us at the age where we were receptive to the world and we were taught this is the way it is. So it takes a lot to understand, and in that understanding there is deconditioning and unlearning. Right? And I'm still amidst this journey. And every book I read by a spiritual thinker who understands what the ego is or has more understanding, it's almost like we're all always getting to the point that isn't there. We're just all on this journey that doesn't end. Whenever I read something by someone who is further along than me, I come to a little bit more of an understanding about the ego. I've been blazing through A Return to Love by Marianne Williamson as our reading update for this episode, and this book in itself has just given me a greater understanding of the ego, the ways that it self-sabotages, the ways that we've been conditioned into over-prioritizing it. This is an important thing to understand, because the more you understand it, the more enlightened you are. The less you understand it, the more in its grasp you are. Do not allow yourself to be imprisoned by your ego. Set yourself free and allow yourself to respond authentically to the present moment, right? Be here now. Be here now. There's no ego here. There's nothing to be threatened by. There's no sense of self to protect. It's all good. It's all good. And as threatening as it feels to start to dissolve the power that the ego has over us, from the other side, I can tell you